Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 326. Chapter 326. In external ways, Pierre had hardly changed at all. In appearance, he was just what he used to be. As before, he was absent-minded and seemed occupied not with what was before his eyes, but with something special of his own. The difference between his former and present self was that formerly he did not grasp what lay before him or what was said to him. He had puckered his forehead painfully, as if vainly seeking to distinguish something at a distance. At present he still forgot what was said to him, and still did not see what was before his eyes. But he now looked with a scarcely perceptible and seemingly ironic smile at what was before him, and listened to what was said, though evidently seeing and hearing something quite different. Formerly, he had appeared to be a kind-hearted but unhappy man, and so many people had been inclined to avoid him. Now, a smile at the joy of life always played round his lips, and sympathy for others shone in his eyes with a questioning look as to whether they were contented as he was, and people felt pleased by his presence. Previously, he had talked a great deal, grew excited when he talked, and seldom listened. Now he was seldom carried away in conversation, and knew how to listen, so that people readily told him their intimate secrets. The princess, who had never liked Pierre, and had been particularly hostile to him since she had felt herself under obligations to him after the old count's death, now after staying a short time in Orel, where she had come intending to show Pierre that in spite of his ingratitude she considered it her duty to nurse him, felt to her surprise and vexation that she had become fond of him. Pierre did not in any way seek her approval. He merely studied her with interest. Formerly, she had felt that he regarded her with indifference and irony, and so had shrunk into herself, as she did with others, and had shown him only the combative side of her nature. Now he seemed to be trying to understand the most intimate places of her heart, and mistrustfully at first, but afterwards gratefully, she let him see the hidden, kindly side of her character. The most cunning man could not have crept into her confidence more successfully, evoking memories of the best times of her youth and showing sympathy with them. Yet Pierre's cunning consisted simply in finding pleasure in drawing out the human qualities of the embittered, hard, and, in her own way, proud princess. Yes, he is a very, very kind man when he is not under the influence of bad people, but of people such as myself, thought she. His servants, too, Terenty and Vaska, in their own way, noticed the change that had taken place in Pierre. They considered that he had become much simpler. Terenty, when he had helped him undress and wished him good night, often lingered with his master's boots in his hands and clothes over his arm, to see whether he would not start a talk. And Pierre, noticing that Terenty wanted to chat, generally kept him there. "Well, tell me. Now, how did you get food?" he would ask. And Terenty would begin talking of the destruction of Moscow and of the old count, and would stand for a long time holding the clothes and talking, or sometimes listening to Pierre's stories, and then would go out into the hall with a pleasant sense of intimacy with his master and affection for him. The doctor who attended Pierre and visited him every day, though he considered it his duty as a doctor to pose as a man whose very moment was of value to suffering humanity, would sit for hours with Pierre, telling him his favorite anecdotes and his observations on the characters of his patients in general, and especially of the ladies. "It's a pleasure to talk to a man like that. He is not one of our provincials," he would say. There were several prisoners from the French army in Orel, and the doctor brought one of them, a young Italian, to see Pierre. This officer began visiting Pierre, and the princess used to make fun of the tenderness the Italian expressed for him. The Italian seemed happy only when he could come to see Pierre, talk with him, tell him about his past, his life at home, and his love, and pour out to him his indignation against the French, and especially against Napoleon. "If all Russians are like you, it is sacrilege to fight such a nation," he said to Pierre. "You, who have suffered so from the French, do not even feel animosity towards them." Pierre had evoked the passionate affection of the Italian merely by evoking the best side of his nature and taking a pleasure in so doing. During the last days of Pierre's stay in Orel, his old Masonic acquaintance, Count Willarski, who had introduced him to the lodge in 1807, came to see him. Willarski was married to a Russian heiress who had a large estate in Orel province, and he occupied a temporary post in the commissariat department in that town. Hearing that Bezukhov was in Orel, Willarski, though they had never been intimate, came to him with the professions of friendship and intimacy that people who meet in a desert generally express for one another. Willarski felt dull in Orel, and was pleased to meet a man of his own circle, and, as he supposed, of similar interests. But to his surprise, Willarski soon noticed that Pierre had lagged much behind the times, and had sunk, as he expressed it to himself, into apathy and egotism. "You are letting yourself go, my dear fellow," he said. But for all that, Willarski found it pleasanter now than it had been formerly to be with Pierre, and came to see him every day. To Pierre, as he looked at and listened to Willarski, it seemed strange to think that he had been like that himself but a short time before. Willarski was a married man with a family, busy with his family affairs, his wife's affairs, and his official duties. He regarded all those occupations as hindrances to life, and considered that they were all contemptible because their aim was the welfare of himself and his family. Military, administrative, political, and Masonic interests continually absorbed his attention. And Pierre, without trying to change the other's views and without condemning him, but with quiet, joyful, and amused smile now habitual to him, was interested in this strange though very familiar phenomenon. There was a new feature in Pierre's relations with Willarski, with the princess, with the doctor, and with all the people he now met, which gained for him the general goodwill. This was his acknowledgment of the impossibility of changing a man's convictions by words, and his recognition of the possibility of everyone thinking, feeling, and seeing things each from his own point of view. This legitimate peculiarity of each individual, which used to excite and irritate Pierre, now became a basis of the sympathy he felt for and the interest he took in other people. The difference, and sometimes complete contradiction between men's opinions and their lives, and between one man and another, pleased him, and drew from him an amused and gentle smile. In practical matters, Pierre unexpectedly felt within himself a center of gravity he had previously lacked. Formerly, all pecuniary questions, especially requests for money, to which, as an extremely wealthy man, he was very exposed, produced in him a state of hopeless agitation and perplexity. To give or not to give, he asked himself. I have it and he needs it. But someone else needs it still more. Who needs it most? And perhaps they are both impostors. In the old days, he had been unable to find a way out of these surmises, and had given to all who asked as long as he had anything to give. Formerly, he had been in a similar state of perplexity with regard to every question concerning his property, when one person advised one thing and another something else. Now, to his surprise, he found that he no longer felt either doubt or perplexity about these questions. There was now within him a judge, who by some rule unknown to him, decided what should or should not be done. He was as indifferent as heretofore to money matters, but now he felt certain of what ought and what ought not to be done. The first time he had recourse to his new judge was when a French prisoner, a colonel, came to him, and after talking a great deal about his exploits, concluded by making what amounted to a demand that Pierre should give him 4,000 francs to send to his wife and children. Pierre refused without the least difficulty or effort, and was afterwards surprised how simple and easy had been what used to appear so insurmountably difficult. At the same time that he refused the colonel's demands, he made up his mind that he must have recourse to artifice when leaving Orel, to induce the Italian officer to accept some money of which he was evidently in need. A further proof to Pierre of his own more settled outlook on practical matters was furnished by his decision with regard to his wife's debts and to the rebuilding of his houses in and near Moscow. His head steward came to him at Orel, and Pierre reckoned up with him his diminished income. The burning of Moscow had cost him, according to the head steward's calculation, about 2,000,000 rubles. To console Pierre for these losses, the head steward gave him an estimate showing that despite the losses his income would not be diminished, but would even be increased if he refused to pay his wife's debts, which he was under no obligation to meet, and did not rebuild his Moscow house and the country house on his Moscow estate, which had cost him 80,000 rubles a year and brought in nothing. "Yes, of course, that's true," said Pierre with a cheerful smile. "I don't need all that. By being ruined, I have become much richer." But in January, Savélich came from Moscow and gave him an account of the state of things there, and spoke of the estimate an architect had made of the cost of rebuilding the town and country houses, speaking of this as of a settled matter. At the same time, he received letters from Prince Vasily and other Petersburg acquaintances speaking of his wife's debts, and Pierre decided that the steward's proposals, which had so pleased him, were wrong, and that he must go to Petersburg and settle his wife's affairs and must rebuild in Moscow. Why this was necessary, he did not know, but he knew for certain that it was necessary. His income would be reduced by 3/4, but he felt it must be done. Wolarski was going to Moscow, and they agreed to travel together. During the whole time of his convalescence in Orel, Pierre had experienced a feeling of joy, freedom, and life. But when during his journey he found himself in the open world and saw hundreds of new faces, that feeling was intensified. Throughout his journey, he felt like a schoolboy on holiday. Everyone, the stagecoach driver, the post-house overseers, the peasants on the roads and in the villages, had a new significance for him. The presence and remarks of Wolarski, who continually deplored the ignorance and poverty of Russia and its backwardness compared with Europe, only heightened Pierre's pleasure. Where Wolarski saw deadness, Pierre saw an extraordinary strength and vitality. The strength, which in that vast space amid the snows maintained the life of his original, peculiar, and unique people. He did not contradict Wolarski, and even seemed to agree with him, an apparent agreement being the simplest way to avoid discussions that could lead to nothing, and he smiled joyfully as he listened to him. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 326. Sorry about that. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 326, Identicalizing. Self-improvement is an immanent phenomenon, emerging outward from interior modifications and manifesting primarily in improved social relations. We see this movement in Pierre after his release from captivity. Yesterday, we read of his pivot towards God and the consequent adoption of a more present, mindful, and universalist psychology. Today, we see how this interior change tweaks his social life. Formerly, he had appeared to be a kind-hearted but unhappy man, and so people had been inclined to avoid him, Tolstoy writes of Pierre. Now, a smile of the joy of life always played around his lips, and sympathy for others shone in his eyes, and a questioning look as to whether they were as contented as he was, and people felt pleased by his presence. The first change Pierre makes is to listen to others, rather than to speak himself. Recall his introduction, way back on day 2 of A Year of War and Peace, when he engages in reverse acts of impoliteness, as he interjects in and rudely prolongs conversations he has no business taking part in. Now he's more likely to remain silent and to listen. This attracts different people to him. This pro-social disposition initiates a virtuous cycle, wherein, quote, this legitimate peculiarity of each individual, which used to excite Pierre, now became a basis of the sympathy he felt for and the interest he took in other people, end quote. and with each new person he meets, the sympathy is compounded. He draws on this compounding interest to make quick, intuitive decisions that profit not only himself, but, more importantly, others. The identicalization of the other signifies Pierre's true interior change. Tolstoy concludes today's chapter by articulating how Pierre improves himself by improving his relations with other people. Quote, Pierre had experienced a feeling of joy, freedom, and life. But when during his journey he found himself in the open world and saw hundreds of new faces, that feeling was intensified. Throughout the journey he felt like a schoolboy on holiday. Everyone, the stagecoach driver, the post house overseers, the peasants on the road and in the villages, had a new significance for him. End quote. Daily meditation. The utterance of God is a lamp, whose light are these words: Ye are the fruits of one tree, and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye with another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship. Baha'u'llah, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 326 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the description. Also in the description, you're going to find a link, or links rather, to my Amazon wish list for books and movies. If you decide to purchase one of those to support me, we'll set up a Zoom call to discuss that book or that movie. Tomorrow, we're going to be reflecting on chapter 327 and also reading it. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.